Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, the podcast that takes you on a trip around the world, introduces you to some of the globe's most unique countries, shares some stories, and otherwise engages you in an understanding of the culture, geopolitics, and history of many places in the world where I've worked during my career. We want to continue on today with our look at Bosnia and Herzegovina, a place that, as you know from the last episode, I'm very conflicted about because I had the opportunity to work there beginning in 2013, and it was the most challenging assignment that I had in my career, and that includes many countries where there was overt conflict. The conflict was long over in Bosnia by the time I got there. The Bosnian War occurred from 1992 to 1996, but it was still a very, very complicated place. And we're going to talk more about that today and continue our discussion. If you haven't got your copy of my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, hope you'll do it. It's available on Amazon. But I also want to tell you just briefly, I don't do this very often, but I wanted to share it with you today. I've got a new novel series that just came out. It's called Mozart's Ghost. That's the first book. The second book is When We Were Young. The third book that just came out is The Monsters Come at Night. This is the Mozart's Ghost novel series. If you like espionage, if you like learning more about countries around the world, if you like action and adventure, you will like this novel series. They're all available on Amazon. Let's jump in now to a continuance of our discussion about Bosnia and Herzegovina. As I said, it's a complicated place, and it was very difficult to have a conversation, even all the years after the war, when I served there, with a Bosniak, a Croat, or a Serb that didn't revert back to a discussion of the war. Most of the stories were very tragic, and I won't relay those here out of deference to the individuals who told me those stories, but absolutely tragic circumstances. But there were some that were tragic in their own way, but still had an element of amusement to them. And I want to share one with you that was told to me by one of my key staff members on the growth-oriented local development project in Sarajevo, Marima Avdajic. Marima and her family endured the entire time of the siege of Sarajevo from 1992 to 1996. And times were very difficult, obviously, during that period. Because of the siege, it was very difficult to get food into the city. The winters during that time were extremely cold and snowy. People didn't have heat. They didn't have electricity. It was a very desperate time. 1,425 days of siege in Sarajevo, and Marima and her family lived through all of it. But she told me one time over lunch that her father went out one day to just try to find any type of food that they could get. And they could usually get bread and maybe a few vegetables, but it was barely keeping the family alive. I mean, it was feeding them, but they were still hungry all the time, and they were very desperate for food security. So her father went out in the city and After a few hours, he came back and he was quite pleased with himself because he had found a live chicken just wandering the streets. And he grabbed that chicken and he brought it back to their apartment. Well, living in an apartment, they didn't know what they were going to do with this chicken, and so Marima's mother suggested, well, let's kill the chicken and eat it. We'll have a chicken dinner. And father said, no, no, no. He said, if we keep this chicken alive, we can get eggs on an ongoing basis. And eggs were almost impossible to get at that point in time. I mean, the prices for commodities were astronomical because it was all on the black market. And so they kept this chicken in their apartment. And Marima said that they grew to hate that chicken because it would defecate all over the apartment. It was a nasty, horrible bird. But they couldn't let it outside because obviously it would be gone, or if they even built a fence for it, somebody would steal the chicken because everybody wanted eggs, and so they had to keep it in the apartment. And she said it was just horrible. It stunk, and yes, it did provide eggs, but everybody hated that chicken. But for years, that chicken continued to provide them a few eggs, and in 1995, when the Dayton Accords happened and the war came to an end, and in 1996, early 1996, the siege of Sarajevo was lifted. Marima's father asked, the war's over now. We need to celebrate. What would you all like to do to celebrate? And it was unanimous in her family. They wanted to kill that chicken and eat it. And she said that was the best chicken dinner she ever had because they hated that chicken so much. And they killed the chicken after all those years and ate it. They did what they wanted to do on the first day when her father found it, and finally got revenge on that foul chicken that had lived in their apartment for all that time. Now, it's in some ways an absurd story, but it also shows the desperation of the people in Sarajevo during that time who literally were having to scavenge for food. There are many instances of mothers and grandmothers going out into the city to just try to find some bread or cheese and being struck down by Serbian or Russian snipers. Russians often came to Bosnia during that time on war tourism, where they would just bring their guns and take target practice on live targets. And there are many stories of mothers, grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers being shot down in the middle of the street while they were going out and just trying to find some bread or cheese. They were shot for sport. They weren't combatants. They weren't bothering anyone. But the Serb army and their supporters would sit up on the hillside with rifles and shoot anything that moved. There was one area of the city around the Parliament building and up to where the Holiday Inn was at that time that was called Sniper's Alley. It had from the Jewish cemetery on the hillside above the Miljaka River. Serbian snipers would sit up there and they had an open shot to this area around the Parliament building, and anyone that went in that area was taking their life in their hands. That's why they called it Sniper's Alley. That time in the history of Sarajevo was absolutely horrifying. And what it did to the psyche of the Bosnian people is something that they'll deal with for the rest of their lives. Anyone who was alive during that period bears the trauma of the siege of Sarajevo. And by the way, Sarajevo was not the only city in Bosnia that was under siege. There were others as well. But it was the longest siege of 1,425 days. Can you imagine a siege of that length of time? You know, when we went through COVID and we had to quarantine or stay in our homes, had restricted movement for more than a year in some cases, it did psychological damage to a lot of people. But what if you had to do that for almost 4 years, and oh, by the way, when you left your house, someone was trying to shoot you in the head, and you couldn't buy food, and you didn't have fuel, and you didn't have electricity, and there were explosions every night from the shelling of forces surrounding the city. This was a horrifying time that Bosnia may never fully recover from. As I said in the last episode of this podcast, the Dayton Accords in 1995 brought the war to an end. It was a negotiated solution, and we'll talk more about the effects of that negotiated solution in just a little bit. But first, I want to talk about what I call the rogues gallery. Some individuals who were the drivers of not just the Bosnian War, but the genocide that occurred as part of that war. Because this was not just a state-on-state war. We need to understand that. This was, in many ways, an insurgency war that involved Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats, and was a very ugly and brutal time in Bosnia's history. There were no rules to the game. These combatants, these soldiers, were doing whatever they wanted. And they were driven by individuals who had very little concern for human life. Now, we hear a lot, and if you go to Bosnia today, you'll hear a lot about the atrocities that the Serbs meted out on the Bosnian people. But we need to understand that atrocities occurred on every side. So I think it's important, as part of this podcast, to really talk about some of the people that were involved in this rogues gallery. And these are just a few. There were many. So that we can understand that this was not just a Serbian issue. Of course, when we talk about the rogues gallery, we have to start with the president of Serbia during that period of time, Slobodan Milosevic. If you watched my episode on Kosovo and Montenegro, in Croatia, we've talked a lot about Slobodan Milosevic already. But he was president of Serbia from 1991 to 1997. It was Milosevic who stoked the fires of nationalism among the Serbs that really created the impetus for the wars in the countries of the former Yugoslavia. He was, by all rights, a Serb nationalist. And his approach to life, his worldview, was that in the breakup of Yugoslavia, Serb nationality was under attack. The Serbian way of life was under attack. And he was very focused on ensuring that not only were Serbs protected, but that Serbs had the dominant position in the countries of the former Yugoslavia. And in doing so, he created the maelstrom that was the wars in the 1990s in the countries of the former Yugoslavia. He either directly or indirectly presided over one of the worst genocides since the Holocaust. It was, by all accounts, ethnic cleansing. He presided over atrocities against the Croats and the Bosniaks as well. Remember, the Bosniaks are Muslim. Croats were, quote unquote, Christian, but obviously a different ethnicity than the Serbs. And the interesting thing about Milosevic is that he was actually regarded highly by the Orthodox Church, who believed that he was defending Christianity. But his approach to the world really gave rise to others in this rogues gallery who then, with his full backing, committed some of the cruelest atrocities of the war. One of those people, and a charter member of this rogues gallery, was Radovan Karadzic, who was president of the Republic of Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was president of the RS from April 7th, 1992 to July 19th, 1996. Karadzic is interesting in that his father was a cobbler and his mother was a peasant girl from a town called Petjenica. But his father, in addition to being a cobbler, was a Chetnik. The Chetniks were a right-wing party in Yugoslavia, and because of his right-wing beliefs, his very nationalistic beliefs, his father had been imprisoned by the communists during World War II and after World War II as well. Karadzic was trained in medicine, and he worked in a hospital in Sarajevo during the 1970s. He also fashioned himself to be a poet, albeit not a very good one. But early on, one could see the signs in Karadzic that led one to believe that he was willing to do whatever it took to benefit himself and those around him. For instance, he spent 11 months in prison for fraud during the 1980s, and continued to manifest traits that one would associate with a criminal element. In 1989, he co-founded the Serb Democratic Party. And this party began to establish Serb autonomous regions in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the 1990s. So this nationalistic view of the world began to manifest itself within Karadzic. And he began to help build Serbian enclaves that were autonomous regions, which of course was the beginning of the destruction of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a society and led up to the Bosnian War. In fact, Karadzic was one of the founders of the Republic of Srpska in 1992. You need to understand that in April of 1992, Bosnia and Herzegovina held an election where they became an independent country. And the Bosniaks and the Croats turned out widely for that election because they very much supported becoming an independent, Western-facing country. On the other side of that coin, most of the Serbs boycotted the election because they felt like that Bosnia and Herzegovina becoming an independent country would not be favorable to the Serb population of the country. So Karadzic became the president of the Republic of Srpska in May of 1992. and served in that role, as I said, until 1996. He was responsible for some of the major atrocities during the Bosnian War, and actually was indicted prior to the war's end by the International Tribunal in The Hague. He barely escaped arrest when he visited the United Nations in 1995. There was a series of errors that allowed him not to be arrested at that particular time. When the war ended with the Dayton Accords, Karadzic became a fugitive, and he took on an assumed name and spent years on the run in that region, being protected by Serbian politicians and many of his friends. He remained on the run until July 21st, 2008, when he was arrested in Belgrade. So that would lead you to believe that the Serbs had protected him for a long period of time. He was transferred to The Hague a few days later on July the 30th and charged with 11 counts of crimes against humanity, including genocide. Because of the bureaucracy involved in the International Tribunal, War Crimes Tribunal, he was not found guilty until March 24, 2016, at which time he was sentenced to life in prison. He's now incarcerated in a prison on the Isle of Wight in the United Kingdom. Another member of this rogues gallery on the Serbian side was Ratko Mladic. He was a Bosnian Serb and former commander of the Army of the Republika Srpska during the Bosnian Wars. Unlike Karadzic, Mladic was, by all intents and purposes, a communist. He's a longtime member of the League of Communists in Yugoslavia. And as a military officer, he presided over some of the most egregious crimes against humanity during the Bosnian War, including the Srebrenica massacre, which we talked about in the first episode. He too is a fugitive from 1996 to 2011 when he was arrested in northern Serbia. It took almost 6 years to try him in The Hague. And in 2017, he was convicted on 17 charges of genocide and sentenced to life in prison. He's evidently ill now and has a very short time to live, and tried to get a pardon based on humanitarian reasons, but that was denied by the court, and he remains in prison to this day. So Mladic and Karadzic both remain in prison serving life sentences. That was on the Serbian side, and there were many others as well that were tried for crimes against humanity, and others that are likely guilty but were not tried. But there were atrocities on the other sides as well. For instance, on the Croat side, one member of the rogues gallery, Milivoj Petković, who from 1990 to 95 was general in the Croatian army and participated in the ethnic cleansing of Serbians during the Bosnian War. He was on the run from 1995 to 2004 when he surrendered to authorities in The Hague, and he was convicted of, get this, 26 counts of atrocities and crimes against humanity, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which he continues to serve. On the Bosniak side, remember the Bosniaks were Muslim. They had their own rogues gallery, made up of people like Rasim Delic and Enver Hadzijević. Delic was chief of staff of the Bosnian army and remained a senior army official after the war, but he was indicted for war crimes in 2005. He was found not guilty on all but one charge and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He died in 2010 in Sarajevo. Hadzi Hasanovic also served as chief of staff of the Bosnian army during that period of the war. And in 2007, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for war crimes. He died in 2024. My point here is that there were wrongs done on every side. Those committed by the Serbs may have been larger in scale, but just as in Kosovo and Croatia, there were enough members of the rogues gallery to cover every ethnic group in Bosnia. Most of these members of the rogues gallery went on the run after the signing of the Dayton Accords, or shortly thereafter, even into early 1996, that ended the war in Bosnia. But as I said in the first episode, how it ended the war has created the most confounding government in the world. One would argue, and I often have argued this, that it is an unworkable government. One that literally is almost unsalvageable and is so far away from being a functional government that one can hardly believe it. I want you to listen. I'm going to walk you through the structure of government that was put in place for Bosnia and Herzegovina by the Dayton Accords. And I want you to listen very carefully. And then you determine in your own mind if this isn't the most complicated governmental structure of which you have ever heard. So, let's start at the beginning. And remember what the Dayton Accords set out to do. The whole role of the Dayton Accords was to stop the killing. Understandable. The war was horrible. At that time, Sarajevo was still under siege. It was a horrible blight on Europe and an escalating problem for the world. And so the Dayton Accords were designed to end the hostilities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And good news, it did that. It took a little while for the siege of Sarajevo to be broken. It took us several months. But for the most part, it did that. And then a UN peacekeeping force was sent to Bosnia and Herzegovina to enforce the Dayton Accords. That's the good news. It largely stopped the killing. What it did not do was solve the problem. It addressed the symptom of the problem, which was the war. It didn't solve the problem, which was the ethnic divides that caused the war. It did nothing to alleviate the animosity that the Bosniaks had for the Serbs, and the Serbs had for the Bosniaks and the Croats, and the distrust that the Bosniaks had for both the Croats and the Serbs. It did nothing to address those issues. What it did do was put in place the most dysfunctional government likely of all time. And I'm going to walk you through now the structure of this government. It has primarily 4 branches. The first branch is the presidency. You're going to love this. Listen carefully. The presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina is elected for a 4-year term by majority popular vote. The member with the highest votes becomes the chair of the presidency. But there is not just one president, there are 3. This includes one Bosniak, one Croat, and one Serb who represent Bosnia, the Bosniaks, Herzegovina, the Croats, and the Republic of Srpska, the Serbs. The chairperson of the presidency rotates among these three members every 8 months. So, for 8 months, the representative of the president of Bosnia is the chair of the presidential council. For 8 months, the president of Herzegovina is. And for 8 months, that presidential representative of the Republic of Srpska serves as the president. The presidency is responsible for foreign policy. It appoints ambassadors, international representatives, executes decisions of the parliamental assembly, and reports to the Parliamentary Assembly on matters touching on the expenditures of the presidency. So, this is just the first of 4 branches, and you can see how convoluted it is. Can you imagine a country with 3 presidents? Have you ever heard of a country with 3 presidents? Of course you haven't. And for them to rotate every 8 months means that there's virtually no continuity within the government at all. That's the presidential branch. The second branch is the executive branch, and that consists of a chair of an executive council that's appointed by the presidency. And the chair of this council then appoints a council of ministers who are once again selected based on ethnicity. Every party has to be, or every ethnic group rather, has to be represented. The Bosniaks, the Croats, the Serbs. So when these appointments are made, the chair of this council is not necessarily selecting the best people. They're trying to select the best people within the specific ethnic groups. And once again, this often leads to conflict between ministers and between different ministries because of ethnic and political differences. That's the executive branch. Then you have the legislative branch. The legislative branch in Bosnia and Herzegovina is a bicameral system represented by the Parliamentary Assembly, which has 2 chambers, the House of the People and the House of Representatives. The House of the People is the upper chamber and consists of 15 members represented proportionally of 5 Serbs, 5 Bosniaks, and 5 Croats. And the members serve for a 2-year term. The House of Representatives has 42 members, proportionally represented between the Croats, Serbs, and Bosniaks, and they serve a 4-year term. The legislature enacts legislation, approves the budget, and ratifies treaties and agreements. The fourth branch is the judicial branch. The judiciary is the legal body of the government that exists independently from the executive branch and the legislature. Bosnia and Herzegovina exist under a civil law system. The Constitutional Court is the supreme legal body consisting of 9 members appointed by the House of Representatives, the People's Republic, the Assembly of the People's Republic of Srpska, and the President of the European Court of Human Rights. Judges are eligible for appointment until they reach the age of 70. The Constitutional Court settles constitutional disputes. The state court is composed of criminal, administrative, and appellate courts which deal with matters within the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Again, very much divided on ethnic lines. 4 branches of government, 3 presidents, ethnically proportioned representation. that undermines the idea of pure democracy. And then, of course, you have the Birchco district, which is an autonomous region of its own. So within this country, you not only have this convoluted governmental system and three primary ethnic groups that distrust and don't like each other, but you also have three separate entities. You have Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have the Republic of Srpska, and you have Birchco district. An absolutely confounding system that was set up by the Dayton Accords. There's a cautionary tale here, ladies and gentlemen. And that cautionary tale is that be careful what you ask for, you might get it. As I said, the Dayton Accords were designed to stop the killing. Mission accomplished. But in doing so, it ensured that Bosnia would be virtually ungovernable in any realistic sense after that. Now, of course, this government is functioning today, so a lot of my Bosnian friends who are listening to this podcast are going to take issue with the fact that I say the country's ungovernable. But when you look at how things work there, the levels of corruption that have been there, the continued ethnic divisions, the overall dysfunction of government, you see that this is a governance system of a country that is, at very best, marginal, at worst, absolutely egregious. And yet, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a fascinating country. You travel around that country and you just can't believe how beautiful it is. You can't believe that in a country that's been the subject of so much hatred and angst and conflict, that this kind of beauty and culture exists. Of course, I lived in Sarajevo. I say I, Debbie and I, we lived in Sarajevo while we were there. As I said earlier, Sarajevo was under siege for 1,425 days, from April 1992 to March 1996, during the Bosnian War. And even when we arrived in 2013, the reminders of that war were still there. Buildings with mortar holes in the side, buildings that were eaten up with the pockmarks of machine gun fire. A closed national museum. Markers around the city as to where shellings occurred and people were killed. Cemeteries and memorials that were constant reminders of the war. And yet Sarajevo had a vibrance and a culture that was very interesting. I was back there recently in Sarajevo after a period of years, and I found it to be even more vibrant now. International companies have moved in, international brands have moved in. It seems like Sarajevo is moving toward becoming a much more modern city than certainly it was after the war, and even was when I arrived there in 2013. And yet, as the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's always this undercurrent of conflict and confrontation within the government and within civil society in Sarajevo. Sarajevo's winters tend to be, they're not as snowy as they used to be, but they tend to be harsh and they tend to be gloomy because you're down in a valley surrounded by mountains, and so gloom or clouds will descend in that valley, and the winters are pretty gray and gloomy. So Debbie and I used to regularly escape to Vienna, which is just a very short flight from Sarajevo. And that's where we really fell in love with Vienna, because we traveled there so much during that period just to get away from the gloom, especially in the wintertime in Sarajevo. I still love to navigate that city, though. I love to navigate its back streets. I love to go up on the mountain above the city and look down on it. I love to go to the old Olympic venues. It's got excellent cafes and restaurants. It's a beautiful city. And nothing in this podcast that I said in this episode or the last one I hope would deter you from going to Bosnia and Herzegovina. You would love it. You'd be fascinated by it. You would think it's one of the most beautiful places you've ever been. I'm just being real with you about the challenges that continue to face that country. Some other cities. Mostar, the UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's about 2.5 hours probably from Sarajevo, through some of the most beautiful countryside you'll ever see. Mostar is an amazing city. Has this iconic bridge. It was destroyed during the war, but then rebuilt. And it is a beautiful mosque and Ottoman architecture, along with a Christian influence as well. The first time I took Debbie there, we were walking across that bridge, and a young man ran by her and jumped off the bridge. And Debbie's like, what is going on? And then other people started to jump off the bridge. And what we realized is that's a local thing. They like to jump off that bridge into the river below. It's something they've done for generations. And now Red Bull has actually developed that bridge as a site for its Red Bull cliff diving competition. And so now professionals from all over the world travel to Mostar to jump into that river off of that iconic bridge. Other cities that were important to me while I was there, because I traveled to them so many times, Tuzla is an industrial town in Bosnia and Herzegovina that where I spent many days in a bad hotel during that flood that I talked about in the last episode. Traveled to Gorazde, the administrative center of the Podrinja canton. It was a site of horrible atrocities during the Bosnian War. A beautiful city. One of my favorite pictures that was taken of me during that time is standing on the hillside above Podgorica. Above Gorazde, rather. In fact, little known fact, one of my former staff members on the growth-oriented local development project there, Edin Chulov, is now the premier of the Podrinja canton. He's a lifetime resident of Gorazde and now is the head man of the entire canton. And so, Edin, if you're out there watching, listening to this podcast, reach out to me, and it'd be great to catch up. Another very beautiful city, probably Debbie's favorite city in Bosnia and Herzegovina, was Bihać, the administrative center of the Una canton. It's up by the Una River, a picturesque place, absolutely beautiful, and a very well put together city. It was under siege for 3 years during the Bosnian War itself, so there's a lot of baggage with that city, but it is categorically beautiful. And then, of course, we traveled to Banja Luka a lot. Banja Luka is the capital of the Republic of Srpska. A lot of my team didn't like to go there because they were Bosniaks, and they had always had trepidation about going to Banja Luka. But as capital of the RS, it is a well put together city, and I have many good friends there. It's a city that has a lot of great culture, nice restaurants, a very livable city. Unfortunately, it is governed by individuals who, let's say, probably don't have the best interest of the entire country of Bosnia and Herzegovina in the forefront, because they are very much still nationalistic. Then there's Ljubuški, another city that I very much liked. It's in the western Herzegovina canton, and it's primarily a Croat city. Very, very nice place. I liked it there very much. And then there's this little Brčko district, which is an autonomous region, and I traveled there on several occasions. Another interesting place. But any direction that you go from Sarajevo is a beautiful city on its own, but any direction that you go from Sarajevo, you're going to go into some of the most beautiful countryside that you've ever seen, and you're going to visit some cities that are extremely interesting. So, to bring this to a close, is there hope for Bosnia and Herzegovina? You've heard me say some pretty, maybe negative's the wrong word, but some pretty strong statements about my thoughts as to whether Bosnia and Herzegovina can be successful. There is hope for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the hope doesn't lie in the governmental structure, because it's a train wreck, and I don't know how you would ever fix it. The hope lies in the people themselves. And I just ask my Bosniak, my Croat, and my Serbian friends to continue to seek to understand each other better, to break down the ethnic barriers that are still there, and to, as much as possible, move on from the past and embrace a future that you want your children to have. This is a beautiful country. It's got so much going for it. And let's hope that the next generation of Bosnians, whether they be Croat, whether they be Bosniak, whether they be Serb, are able to move past the historical conflicts that have existed. It's going to be a big challenge, because the political system is structured in such a way to undermine that. But ultimately it comes down to people. And we know that war doesn't work. You've been down that road. Bosnians should know better than anyone else how damaging war can be. The future lies in understanding, in empathy, in tolerance, that comes through dialogue, and comes through working together, and comes through eating meals together, and understanding both the cultural similarities and differences, and in considering yourselves Bosnians first, and not just Croats who live in Bosnia, or Serbs who live in the Republic of Srpska, or Bosniaks who live in this very complicated country. So what about the Republic of Srpska? Well, as I said, it's governed by some individuals who represent a pretty big challenge to stability. I believe that if the Republic of Srpska felt like they continually had the backing of the country of Serbia that they did when Slobodan Milosevic was president, that many of the ethnic issues of the past could definitely rise again in the country. It's a complicated place, and I don't have the answer. This was my business for many, many years. but I don't have the answer for Bosnia and Herzegovina. It truly is, as I said in the first episode on this country, in many ways that white whale. And me, like Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, kept pursuing the answer to the riddle. But I don't have the answer. But here's a newsflash. Nobody else does either. The Dayton Accords weren't the answer. They were the answer for the symptom. They were the medicine for the symptom, but they did nothing to cure the disease. And that's what plagues Bosnia and Herzegovina to this day, is that the disease of nationalism, of intolerance, of lack of understanding, of distrust, is still there. Just like a cancer, it's eating away at that country. So am I sorry I ever worked there? No. As I said before, I probably learned more during the period that I worked in Bosnia and Herzegovina about not only the international development business, but about myself than anywhere else I've worked. And believe me, it was ugly. What I saw about the business that I was in and about my own personal dealings was ugly. It's something that I wish I didn't have to even talk about, quite frankly. But in doing so, I've come to grips with the work that we did there and the good that we did there, even though we didn't accomplish nearly what we wanted to. We accomplished some good things there. And I became a better person for going through that very difficult experience, because that was the moment that I came to a crossroads and I could go one way or the other. I could go one way, and that would have led to so many challenges and heartaches. Or the other way, which has led to where I am now, which is someone who can look back on a career that was largely a successful career and be happy about the legacy that I've built and happy about the life that I'm living now. Fortunately, with the strong support of my friends, my family, and most importantly, Debbie and Daniel, I chose the path that led me to where I am now. It could have very easily gone the other way. So Bosnia was that seminal moment. And everything that I'm going to talk about in the future in this podcast really, in some ways, connects to that decision on which path to take. So, to all my friends who are Bosnians, thank you. Thank you for the trust you had in me. Thank you for the work we did together. Thank you for all the support you've given me since then. But also thank you for pressing me and putting me in a position where I had to recalibrate everything in my life, because it made me a better person. We're going to start in on another country during our next episode. So tune in next Monday, 8 a.m. And we will hopefully entice you to dive deeply into yet another very interesting country in the world. Until then, have a great week, and I'll see you next time on some stops along the way.